What if the most powerful medicine in medieval times wasn't found in a dusty alchemist's lab, but in a simple, fragrant garden? Prepare to have your perceptions of ancient healing shattered as we uncover the incredible, often hidden, medical secrets cultivated right under people's noses. But just beyond those gardens, behind monastery walls, and within the stone chambers of castles and churches, another secret flourished. Not one of herbs and healing, but of justice, twisted, raw, and holy. Because in the medieval world, truth wasn't something you argued. It was something you proved or failed to under the watching eye of God. And the body, trembling under flame or drowned in silence, was the courtroom before lawyers, before precedent, before rights or rules. Justice in the early Middle Ages was not about clarity or fairness. It was about fear and faith. Imagine this. A man accused of theft stands trembling in a village square. He denies the charges, but no one speaks for him. No counsel, no evidence. Instead, a glowing iron bar is pulled from a bed of coals. His task? To carry it in bare hands, then walk several measured paces. His hands are wrapped and sealed. In 3 days, a priest will unwrap the bindings. If the wounds fester, he is guilty. If they heal clean, God has spoken. Innocent, this was trial. By ordeal, a terrifying fusion of superstition, faith, and authority. There were no juries, no documents, only ritual and the divine. Ordeal by fire was but one path. There was also ordeal by water. The accused, often bound, would be thrown into a river. If they floated, the water, considered pure, had rejected them. Guilty. If they sank, innocent. Though that innocence often came at the cost of their life. More martial men preferred ordeal by combat. Two would fight, and God, it was believed, would grant victory to the righteous. The concept of divine judgment turned warfare into justice, often favoring the strong, the well-armed, or the politically connected that we might recoil at this now. But to the medieval mind, it was consistent. God was the final judge, and the body a vessel for his will. Pain, injury, or death were not just consequences. They were messages from heaven. And in a world where literacy was rare and power skewed to the few, the raw theater of the ordeal was often the only language available. Yet, even within this brutality, cracks began to form as Europe slowly emerged from feudal isolation. Kings grew wary of local lords dispensing justice like gods. The church, too, began questioning whether divine will could truly be read in blisters and bruises. And so, under pressure both political and theological, ordeals began to fade to in 1215. A decisive blow was struck, not with a sword, but a decree. The Fourth Lateran Council, under Pope Innocent III, forbade clergy from participating in ordeals. This one act severed the ritual from its holy anchor. Without priests to bless, oversee, or interpret them, ordeals crumbled. And into that vacuum came the law. But law, in the early medieval sense, was a wild creature, local, inconsistent, and rooted in oral custom. Each shire or manor might follow its own traditions. What was theft in one village might be tolerated in another. Justice was tribal, personal, and above all, unpredictable. It took conquest to bring order. When William the Conqueror crossed the Channel in 1066 and claimed the throne of England, he didn't just bring knights and castles, he brought a new way of thinking. The Normans understood the power of centralization. They began gathering local customs, writing them down, and applying them consistently across the realm. This was the birth of common law. Under William and his successors, traveling judges, justiciars, were dispatched throughout England to hear cases and resolve disputes. These judges began to record their decisions, and over time, those rulings became reference points. Precedent. This idea, known as stare decisis, changed everything. It meant the past could speak into the present. that similar cases should be decided similarly. Suddenly, justice was no longer a solitary moment of divine intervention. It became a living dialogue, stretching backward in time. But common law was more than rules. It was infrastructure, intellectual, social, and deeply political. It tied villages to cities, peasants to lords, lords to crown. And in doing so, it created something almost unheard of in the medieval world: accountability. Yet who would decide? In the ancient ordeals, guilt was decided by nature or by blood. But with common law came an idea just as revolutionary. The jury.it didn't begin as impartial. Early juries were local men, expected to know the accused, to testify as witnesses, not weigh evidence. Their judgments were shaped by rumor, familiarity, and fear, but slowly, painfully, the jury evolved. The Magna Carta, signed in 1215, the same year ordeals were banned, cemented the idea that no free man should be punished without the lawful judgment of his peers. It was more symbolic than functional at first. Yet it marked the dawn of due process, a concept that would echo across centuries and continents. Over time, the jury shifted from accuser to arbiter, from insider to outsider. It stopped being a village affair and started becoming a legal institution. Neutral, observant, and, at its best, just. Still, this evolution was not clean. Power resisted reform. Kings quarreled with barons. Judges feared losing control. But the shift had begun, and once juries took root, they transformed the entire landscape of justice. Now, instead of asking God through ordeal, society began asking its own people. And while the common law reshaped England, a different force was shaping Europe, one far older and far more secretive: canon law. Administered by the Church, canon law dealt with matters of morality, doctrine, and the soul. But it wasn't confined to churches or monasteries. Ecclesiastical courts often held jurisdiction over marriage, inheritance, and even moral offenses like adultery or blasphemy. Their laws were complex, their archives vast. They had written codes centuries before royal courts did. And because the Church transcended borders, canon law traveled, evolving into one of the earliest transnational legal systems in the Western world. But something curious happened as royal courts gained sophistication. They began borrowing from canon law. Concepts like written testimony, the role of oaths, and even procedural fairness found their way into secular practice. And just as gardens had once blurred the line between healing and nature, canon law blurred the line between morality and legality. The Church's influence, often painted today as overbearing or regressive, in fact sowed the seeds of later judicial restraint. It introduced a framework that could constrain even kings. And in doing so, it offered a model, flawed but enduring, of law as something above individual will. As the Middle Ages wore on, the brute simplicity of the ordeal gave way to the intricate dance of procedure. Judges no longer relied on divine signs, but on documents, testimony, and rules. Juries matured into the adversarial format we now recognize. And the Church's legal mind, sharpened through centuries of theological argument, left fingerprints across every legal code in Europe. But justice in the medieval world wasn't only about violence and law. Just as healing wasn't found only in the apothecary's flask. There were contracts being written, land being exchanged, promises being enforced. A new economy was forming, based not on blood, but on trust, a trust that would require its own laws and its own form of justice. The sword was slowly being replaced by the scroll. In the quiet chambers of monasteries and the cluttered desks of royal clerks, a new kind of power was emerging, not brute force, not divine wrath, but the written word. A parchment sealed with wax could settle disputes once fought over with axes. A signature could transfer more land than an army. And behind this subtle revolution was an idea more radical than any battlefield: that promises, could be enforced. As trade began to reawaken Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, so too did the need for a different kind of justice. Markets were forming, not just in cities, but along pilgrimage routes, in ports, at crossroads. Goods changed hands. Services were rendered. Money, coined, counted, and taxed, began to circulate. But with it came risk, fraud, betrayal. The medieval world needed contracts. And so merchants, artisans, and landowners began to draft agreements, simple, at first, often oral, later written, witnessed, and stored. These documents were primitive by modern standards, but they carried weight. Break your word, and you could find yourself summoned not to a duel, but to court. The church again played a curious role here. The concept of a contract resonated deeply with canon law, which viewed promises, especially oaths sworn before God, as sacred. To breach a contract was not only a civil offense, but a moral one. And so, what began as a tool of commerce became a deeply moral architecture, one that assumed, at its core, that individuals had the capacity and responsibility to bind themselves to truth. But what of property? To the medieval mind, land was life. It fed, sheltered, and defined you. Yet ownership was not simple. Under the feudal system, no one truly owned land outright, not even kings. All land was held of someone else, a vassal, from a lord from a duke from the crown, and the crown, symbolically, from God. This created a vast, complex web of obligations. A patch of farmland might owe labor to one lord, military service to another, and tithes to the church. Inheritance was governed by custom, which varied wildly. Land disputes were frequent, emotional, and often devastating. And yet, through this complexity, early property law emerged. Disputes had to be settled. Borders needed clarity. And so records began to form. Charters, deeds, tax rolls like England's Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, which listed nearly every acre of arable land. Who held it, and what it was worth. This was more than bureaucracy. It was a new vision of society, not just who ruled, but who owed what to whom. Justice was no longer only about guilt or innocence. It was about structure, continuity, memory. But even as these civil systems matured, the question of punishment loomed large. For centuries, justice had been personal. If a man wronged you, it was your right, sometimes your duty, to seek vengeance. Blood feuds were common. Honor demanded retribution. But this was chaos disguised as justice. A single insult could spiral into generations of killing. To solve this, the state, whether king, duke, or council, began asserting itself as the true arbiter of punishment. Crime was redefined not just as a harm to the victim, but as a violation of public order. Thus emerged criminal law, and with it, punishments meant not merely to hurt, but to deter. Some were brutally symbolic. A thief might lose his hand. A liar might have his tongue pierced. A forger might be branded with a hot iron. Public executions became theatrical warnings. Justice wasn't just done, it was seen to be done. But punishment was not always physical. In many towns, fines became common, especially for the wealthy. A noble might avoid mutilation but pay dearly in coin. In this, we see the emergence of class justice, a system that claimed universality but, in practice, spared those with influence. Yet beneath even this flawed hierarchy, something deeper was stirring, the idea that justice could be reasoned. Not invoked, not feared, but understood. This was radical and dangerous, because to reason about justice meant to question it, to ask whether laws served the people or only their rulers. And these questions found fertile ground in the emerging universities of Paris, Bologna, Oxford, where legal scholars began studying ancient Roman texts long forgotten. The rediscovery of Roman law in the 12th century ignited a legal renaissance. Roman concepts like persona, legal identity, dominium, ownership, and contractus, agreement, were dissected, debated, and reinterpreted. Civil law systems across Europe began absorbing these ideas, merging them with local custom and canon law. The result was a strange and fascinating hybrid, a medieval legal consciousness that blended ancient Roman rationalism, Christian morality, feudal loyalty, and mercantile pragmatism. It was inconsistent, often contradictory, but it was alive. And in that living, breathing chaos, new legal roles began to emerge. Not lawyers in the modern sense, but advocates, notaries, scribes, figures who navigated the labyrinth for others, often wielding immense, if invisible, power. Law had become its own language, a language most people could not read, let alone speak. But those who could reshaped kingdoms. Consider the case of Henry de Bracton, a 13th-century English judge whose writings compiled hundreds of legal decisions and reflected deeply on justice itself. He argued that even the king must be under God and the law, for the law makes the king, not the other way around. This was heresy to tyranny, a dangerous notion, and yet it planted seeds. Seeds that would flower centuries later in revolutions and declarations, but whose roots, gnarled and tangled, trace back to medieval manuscripts written by candlelight. Still, the question remains, was this system truly just? Can a system that emerged from ordeal, that favored the literate, the landed, and the male, truly be called just? Perhaps not by modern standards. But justice, in the medieval sense, was not about equality. It was about order, a divine order reflected in earthly law, a great chain of being, with God above and every creature, person, and institution beneath, in its proper place. To challenge that order was to court chaos or heresy, and yet people did, quietly, persistently, rebelliously. Women argued cases in local courts. Peasants filed land claims. Guilds demanded legal rights. Even serfs, bound to the land, found ways to negotiate, to protest, to use the system, even when it was stacked against them. Because law, once born, cannot be unmade. It adapts. It spreads. And sometimes it listens. By the close of the Middle Ages, Europe had transformed. The trial by ordeal had vanished. Juries had matured. Laws were written, stored, debated. Contracts bound strangers. Land could be inherited, sold, or seized. The church's grip had loosened. Royal power had tightened. And somewhere between parchment and punishment, the modern world began to stir. Yet justice remained elusive. Because justice is not a system. It's a dream. And in the medieval dreamscape, that dream was often a nightmare. But it was a beginning. Still, questions linger. What hidden forces shaped this evolution? What fragments of forgotten law still echo in our courtrooms today? What ancient texts, sealed in monasteries, buried beneath ruins, or burned by inquisitors, might reveal how justice once aspired to be something more? The answers lie not only in archives, but in memory, in the ruins of old courts, in the worn grooves of judgment seats, in faded ink and broken seals, in the whispers of systems that once ruled not only lands, but the fates of men and women. And in the final part of our journey, we'll go deeper still, into the unknown legacies of medieval justice, the spiritual and symbolic forces behind legal authority, and the secrets that may have been deliberately erased from history. Because sometimes what was hidden on purpose. This completes part 2. I'm ready for part 3 when you are. You said, give me part 3 with a hook for like subs. ChatGPT said, certainly. Below is part 3 of your cinematic, immersive script titled Medieval Justice: How Laws Were Made Without Lawyers. This final segment deepens the mystery, explores the philosophical undercurrents of law and power, touches forbidden themes like lost texts and deliberate erasure, and ends with a haunting, thought-provoking tone. At your request, I've also woven in a brief and natural hook encouraging subscriptions. crafted to maintain the immersive, cinematic tone without breaking the documentary flow. Before the gavel, before the black robes, before the codes etched in marble and sealed by constitutions, there was only voice and ritual, fear and parchment, power and prayer. But behind every law ever written, every trial ever held, and every judgment ever cast, there is something deeper, a belief that justice is real, that order can be made from chaos, that somewhere someone is watching. But what if the origin of that belief wasn't just religion or governance or necessity? What if law itself, like fire or language, was a gift or a secret? In the dim libraries of forgotten monasteries, in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, and in the coded language of legal scrolls now crumbling into dust, there are traces of something older, stranger, references to theophany trials, rituals said to call down divine presence into courtrooms. Not metaphorically, but literally. Ancient invocations, sacred geometry hidden in courtroom layout, symbols carved into the floor beneath the judge's seat, now worn invisible by centuries of silence. These fragments are not found in legal textbooks. They are whispered through side notes, lost in translations, buried by inquisitors, kings, and reformers who sought to make justice a tool of the state, not a mystery of the cosmos. But in the early Middle Ages, especially before the 10th century, there were legal rites indistinguishable from magic, oaths sworn not just to God, but through God, backed by relics, blood, or fire. A 9th century Frankish codex describes a process by which a man accused of heresy would be locked in a stone chamber overnight with a copy of the Gospels. If he was found dead by morning, the accusation was true. No record survives of how many were buried in silence by this rite. Other texts speak of justice circles, ceremonial spaces used by tribal elders across Celtic and Germanic territories, marked with standing stones. These were not trials, but spiritual reckonings. The accused would enter the circle alone, surrounded by elders chanting sacred phrases, some of which appear nowhere else in historical record. Scholars dismiss them as superstition, but others believe they encoded knowledge too dangerous to survive the rise of the centralized church. Still others point to the Book of Edric, a now-lost manuscript referenced in 12th century legal commentaries, said to contain legal formulas that could bind the will of kings through sacred contract. It vanished during the burning of Glastonbury in 1184. Whether it ever existed cannot be proven. But this brings us to the most haunting part of medieval justice: erasure. What we remember of the past is only what was allowed to survive. And justice, by its very nature, silences what it punishes. Inquisitions burned heretical treatises. Royal scribes rewrote legal charters. Canon lawyers recodified traditions to align with shifting doctrine. Entire systems of justice, pagan, tribal, matrilineal, were stamped out, their records lost not to time, but to design. Consider the Salic laws used by the Franks. At first, they included sections on women's inheritance rights, communal judgments, and sacred groves used in legal ceremonies. Later versions omit these. What changed? Who chose what stayed? And what vanished? Law was never neutral. It was a story told by the victors, polished, codified, and passed down as truth. But here's where history becomes philosophy. Because if justice is built on law, and law is built on memory, and memory is built on omission, then what exactly are we standing on? And what have we forgotten? Modern law prides itself on objectivity. Yet echoes of medieval thought remain. Trial rituals, courtroom design, judicial oaths. The powdered wigs of British judges. The Latin phrases still uttered in American courts. Even the concept of a jury of peers finds its earliest roots in feudal obligation. But what if those traditions aren't just symbolic? What if, by preserving them, we've preserved something else, a whisper from the past? A hidden architecture. Point one that still shapes us. without our consent. And perhaps, by studying the medieval, by reading between the parchment lines, we glimpse something forbidden. That law isn't just about order. It's about belief. Not belief in the divine, but in meaning, in consequence, in a world that responds to our actions, not by chance, but with purpose. And so we must ask, are we still ruled by medieval systems we no longer understand? Does justice today wear a modern face, but speak with an ancient voice? And if so, whose voice is it? These are the questions that matter, the ones hidden beneath the surface, beneath precedent, beneath parchment, beneath history itself. And if this journey through forgotten justice, suppressed systems, and sacred secrecy has opened something for you, stay with us. There are more stories buried beneath the surface, more truths waiting to be unearthed. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this is only the beginning. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets, and somewhere beneath the ruins of ordeal and oath, something waits, watching that we'll find it, together.